At the dinner table, she didn't even lower her voice when she said it. She passed the bread basket, smiled like she was making polite conversation, and told my son I was starting to become a burden. Not being a burden, starting to become one. Like it was an evolution. Like it was just the natural way of things. I sat at the head of that table. The same table I'd paid for, polished, protected through 25 winters and one fire. I was holding my tea mug like a life preserver, and I remember how my hands didn't tremble, not even a twitch, but something inside me folded then, neatly, like a letter being prepared for a goodbye. I'm so glad you're here. Stay with me until the end and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far this story travels. When I think back on it now, I suppose the unraveling began long before that dinner, but I didn't want to see it. I was too busy staying grateful, staying out of the way. I told myself it was temporary, this feeling of being misplaced. When I was younger, I had my hands in everything raising my son, sewing costumes for school plays, wrapping ankle sprains in the middle of the night. I made soup for fevers and picked out colleges with him even when he pretended not to care. I taught him to drive in the old Ford with the broken mirror, and I never once raised my voice when he reversed into the hedges. Then came her, the daughter-in-law, with the shiny hair and the iced coffee cups that never seemed to leave rings on the table. She was sweet in the beginning. Gracious, overly so. She'd smile when I spoke, but never ask me anything. That's how it begins, doesn't it? Slamming doors or cruel words. Just silence, just omission. They lived in my house. After my husband passed, I didn't want to live alone, and they insisted. Said it would be better for everyone, mortgage, one kitchen, family, all under one roof. My son promised I'd always have my space. I gave them the master bedroom, took the room at the back with a garden view. I didn't mind. I liked waking up to the light falling over the lavender bush, but bit by bit, began to notice the shift. There was the time I walked into the kitchen and the conversation stopped, like someone had hit a switch. My name spoken just before I knew. I named spoken just before I named to. I named to be try. And we all know I've been exploring that. And we all know I've been exploring that path. I began to notice the we, they, come, there as we see. We was that we made they see with 15. I named me us with 16 sides. FAW. Every we need to see they need we need to see we need we need to see with and they see to see like Kevin need to see we to see we to see sukisakai did it with you to the we could hide it with that attack the kifrak you could we you to the cat the kid can we is I cat the cat the ski what you could do to up I the ski got cat carry make I would wait great the cat stepped in her voice, tight like a lid on a jar. The way my son looked at his plate and didn't say anything. Or the afternoon my friend Connie called, and I heard her say she'd been told I was unwell, resting a lot. I wasn't unwell. I had just stopped being included. They began to manage my mail. Said they'd simplify things for me. I remember feeling silly for being relieved. Less paperwork, fewer envelopes. I told myself it was kind, efficient. But then I noticed things were missing little things at first. A statement here, a letter there. I asked once, gently, and she laughed it off. Said maybe I misplaced it, or maybe I'd imagined it came at all. One night I couldn't sleep. I walked past the living room and saw them on the couch. Heads closed, her tablet open. Something about legal documents on the screen. I didn't speak. I stood behind the corner wall and I heard her say I wouldn't even notice. That at this stage it was just paperwork. That it would be easier if things were decided before anything got messy. Before what got messy. I started checking things quietly, in the morning while they were gone. The filing cabinet still had a few things of mine. I found a packet from the bank unopened, addressed to me. I opened it slowly, my fingertips shaking for the first time in years. It wasn't just about the utilities. It was about a mortgage refinance I didn't remember approving, a title adjustment, co-ownership listed with my son's name and hers. My name's still there, but smaller, like a courtesy. I called the lawyer who'd handled my husband's estate. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but he remembered me. His kind voice. Took his time. I asked questions I never thought I'd ask. I learned phrases like transfer on death and power of attorney revocation. I started writing things down in a notebook with a green velvet cover. It was the last gift my son gave me 2 Christmases ago. I didn't cry. Not once. That part surprised me. Instead, I started to move differently. Quietly. I went through the kitchen drawers and pulled my birth certificate from beneath the pasta machine. I found the folder with my husband's will, the old one, before the house was part of the conversation. I remembered what he told me once when we were sealing the deck after that awful rainstorm. Protect what's yours, even if it means doing it alone. One afternoon, I drove to the county clerk's office. I sat across from a woman named Terry, who wore bright green nail polish and never once made me feel small. She helped me order certified copies of everything. She explained things slowly. She even offered me a tissue, though I didn't use it. When I got back, she was in my room. Not hers, not the mastermind. She was holding my jewelry box, said she was tidying, said she thought maybe it was time to simplify, downsize. I thanked her calmly and asked her to leave the door open next time. That night, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in a while. My son's ex-husband, his first love, the one from college. It's the one my son broke, then buried with silence. We hadn't spoken in 15 years, but when he answered, I could hear something in his voice that sounded like home. We met for coffee. I wore a scarf I hadn't worn in years, pale blue with tiny embroidered leaves. He looked older, softer, and when I handed him the folder and asked if he'd help me transfer the deed legally. Carefully and without delay, he didn't ask why. He just said yes. When the paperwork went through, I waited 1 full week. Then, at dinner, I placed the envelope on the table, told them the deed had been transferred, told them it was no longer theirs to manipulate, that I had quietly chosen someone I could trust. Someone who once knew the meaning of family. They didn't yell. They didn't beg. They sat still. My son looked like he'd been dropped into cold water. She stood up, walked out, didn't even take her glass. I moved out the next morning. My things were already packed, left the wind chimes by the porch, and the lemon tree that never bore fruit. I didn't need them anymore. I had found my own ground. Now I sit in a small house by the water, the kind with a wide front porch and enough quiet to hear my thoughts again. I walk every morning. I plant basil. I write letters even if I never send them. I sleep through the night. It's strange how long you can go without realizing you've disappeared. Not from the world. Exactly, but from the picture your family carries in their minds. They still say your name sometimes. They still hand you things, still nod when you speak, but there's a hollowness behind their eyes. They don't really see you. Not anymore. I started to notice it in the smallest ways. The calendar on the fridge used to have my handwriting all over it. I'd write reminders, appointments, notes for dinner. I always used blue ink, always printed, in soft capital letters. But one day, I saw the entire month filled in, written in her tight, sharp cursive. Doctor visits, grocery lists, vacation plans I hadn't heard about. My birthday wasn't marked. Neither was my podiatry appointment. When I asked about it, she smiled and said she'd just been trying to help. That she thought I liked resting more now. Resting as if stillness had become my default state. As if being quiet and tired was just my way of moving through the world now, and not something imposed on me. I suppose I began to shrink into that silence without even noticing. My friends stopped calling, one by one. Sometimes they left messages, sometimes not. I'd call back and a daughter or nephew would answer and say they were busy, or napping, or that their phone had been acting funny. I stopped being invited. To dinners, to the book club I helped start years ago. I remember I once asked her gently if she'd moved my phone. It had vanished from the windowsill where I always left it to charge. She said she hadn't touched it, but later that night I found it in the linen closet, wedged between two old pillowcases. No explanation, no apology, just a blank look when I brought it up. Like I was the one making things strange. That's how they make you doubt yourself, I think. Not with big betrayals, at least not at first, but with tiny edits to your life, little rewirings of your routine, until suddenly nothing feels familiar anymore. The towels are folded differently. The lamp you always used is gone. Your favorite mug is mysteriously cracked. You wake up one day and your world has been rearranged in your sleep. I didn't tell anyone how it made me feel. Not then. Not even myself. Really. I'd walk the garden path behind the house. It's the one my husband and I built after his third surgery, and I'd water the pots like everything was fine. The tomatoes were ripening. The basil thrived. Life looked normal from the outside, but inside, I felt like a guest, a tolerated one. There was a particular afternoon that sits heavy in my memory. Late spring, the kind of day where the light is too pretty to match your mood. I was in the living room, knitting in my usual chair. I could hear them upstairs. Not fighting, not exactly. Just sharp words, hushed tones. The kind of conversation you have when you think the person downstairs won't understand or remember anyway. She said she thought it was time to have the conversation, that I was showing signs. Though she didn't say signs of what, but her friend Angela had. Dealt with the same thing with her mother-in-law, and it had gotten ugly fast. That it would be better to act before things got out of hand? Out of hand? I sat there with my yarn in my lap. My needles paused mid-stitch, and I felt my heart break in a very quiet, undramatic way. Not because of what she said, but because my son didn't disagree. He didn't defend me, didn't say I was still sharp, still present. He just mumbled something about figuring it out, about needing time, like I was a scheduled conflict. A task they hadn't checked off yet. That night, I made tea in the kitchen after they'd gone to bed. I stirred the sugar in, slowly, watching the steam curl into the light. And for the first time, I allowed myself to think that maybe they were planning something. Not out of cruelty. I don't think it was that, but out of convenience. I had become an inconvenience. It's a soft, quiet problem they were preparing to solve. The next day, I went to the mailbox early, before anyone else was awake. I used to love opening it back when it brought cards, newsletters, catalogs, with silly dog slippers and lemon-printed aprons. But that day, it felt like a vault. Inside was a thick envelope addressed to me, but already sliced open. Carefully, like someone had steamed it or used one of those flat silver letter openers, kept in the office drawer. The one she had taken last month for a work thing. Envelope held a copy of a medical directive. Key? My name. My son's signature. Her signature beneath it. The date was recent. So the wording was clinical and cold. Words like incapacity, decision-making authority, designated agent, no one had told me. I sat down on the porch steps. The sun was rising behind the eucalyptus trees, casting long shadows across the grass. I stared at the signature line, at how neat my son's name looked, at how mine wasn't even needed. It's just my presence, my quiet compliance. And for a long while, I didn't move. I felt like I was vanishing. Like the woman I used to be, the mother, the friend, the planner, the backbone had been slowly erased. And in her place stood this faded outline of a person too quiet to be threatening, too slow to be included, too polite to fight. But that day was the first time I let the anger rise. Not loud, not wild, but quiet and clear. Like the morning light stretching across the tiles, I wasn't going to disappear without looking them in the eye first, without leaving a trace, without choosing, for once. What came next? I didn't speak to them for 2 days after I found that envelope, not out of malice, just out of necessity. I needed to hear my own thoughts again before theirs took over. That house echoed with her voice more than mine. And when my son did speak, it was always cautious now. Like I might break if he was too firm, or like he might. The silence was a gift. I kept to my room mostly. I ate when they were gone or busy. I took long walks around the block. The spring wind had picked up again, brushing the tops of the hedges and scattering the petals from the pink dogwood tree. I watched it all like a woman return to the world from somewhere far inside herself. And in a way that envelope changed everything. Not just because of what it contained, but because it forced me to admit what I'd been denying for months, maybe years. They were planning for my decline. They didn't see me as capable anymore. Not fully, not with respect. They saw my slowness as evidence, my stillness as surrender. They were already drafting their version of the ending. And I hadn't even been allowed to hold the pen. I don't think betrayal always announces itself loudly. Sometimes it comes dressed as concern. It's a soft voice that says, "Let us take care of things for you. Let us handle the complicated parts. Let us carry the burden." And one day you look down and realize you are the burden. That morning, found myself at the kitchen table with a legal pad. The yellow kind I used to buy for grocery lists back when I still made all the meals. I began writing down what I remembered: dates, names, account numbers, passwords. I didn't trust my memory to hold it all neatly anymore. Not because I was losing it, but because doubt is contagious. If enough people tell you your memory is fragile, you begin to question even the strongest recollections. I remembered where my original will was stored. I remembered the name of the lawyer who drafted it, Harold Lichtman. A man with square glasses and warm hands, who once told me he admired my decisiveness. I called his office. His assistant answered, a young man named Theo, who spoke kindly, and didn't ask why I was calling after so many years. I told him I needed to come in. He asked if I was under pressure or distress. I told him no. I was finally thinking clearly. That seemed to satisfy him. When I hung up, I sat still for a long time. I listened to the sound of the dishwasher in the kitchen, the hum of something mechanical shifting beneath the walls. This house, my house, didn't even feel like mine anymore. Every rug had been replaced with her chosen palette. Soft grays, pale creams. My floral tea towels were in a bin in the garage. The rocking chair I'd nursed my son in had been donated without my knowledge. She said it was broken. I hadn't even known it was gone until I found the empty corner where it once lived. There's a grief that comes not from death, far from slow displacement. You're still alive, still waking up in your bed, still folding your laundry, but your life has already been curated by someone else. A version of you is being staged, controlled, diminished. And the worst part, they still expect you to be grateful for it. The day of the appointment, I wore my gray sweater. It's the one with the thin blue piping around the collar. I wore lipstick, too. Not for anyone, just to remind myself I still could. I left the house without telling them. It felt like a small rebellion, but an important one. The kind that belongs entirely to you. Harold was older, of course. We both were. But his eyes hadn't changed. He welcomed me in. Didn't rush me. Offered me water in a real glass. I told him everything. Not the dramatic version, just the truth, plain and slow. When I mentioned the title adjustment, he nodded. When I handed him the envelope with the medical directive, he didn't react. Just read it carefully and asked me if I'd consented to it. I told him I hadn't. Not directly. He underlined a section with a soft pencil, then slid the paper toward me. "You have options," Kay said. I almost cried when I heard that because no one had said that to me in a long time. We made a plan. I wanted the house protected. Yes, but not just for revenge. I wanted control returned to me. I wanted the truth written down, legally and clearly in ink that couldn't be edited after I was gone. And I wanted it done soon. Before she made her next move, I asked Harold how soon a title could be changed again. He said with the right documents and a trusted party. It could happen within the week. That night, I opened a box I hadn't touched in years. It held cards, photographs, and the letter my son's ex-husband once wrote me the last Christmas they were together. It was a thank you note. Long, handwritten, careful. He thanked me for making space for him in the family. He said I'd treated him with more warmth than he'd ever known. I read it twice. I looked at his signature. Then I folded it neatly and placed it in my handbag. The next morning, I called an old number. It still worked. And the voice on the other end still sounded like someone I could trust. The truth is, I wasn't planning revenge. I was reclaiming authorship. It's the story they were writing about me, about my decline, my limitations. My silence wasn't the one I had chosen. And if they were going to write me out of their version of the future, then I would write myself. Back into it, but this time I'd hold the pen. I didn't tell anyone I was meeting him. I didn't need permission. We chose a small cafe 2 towns over. It's a kind with real cream in little pitchers and cloth napkins that didn't match. I arrived early and sat by the window, hands folded over my purse like I was holding something fragile. And in a way, I was. My resolve was there, tucked between my fingers, waiting to be tested. He walked in wearing a navy coat and that same quiet expression he used to wear when my son would get too loud. The same calm I remembered from Thanksgivings when he'd help me clear plates without being asked. When he saw me, he smiled without hesitation. Not the polite kind, not the forced one you give to people from your past. It was softer, familiar. We didn't hug. I'm not sure why. Maybe because if I did, I would have cried. Instead, he slid into the booth and said, simply, "I'm here." And I said, "Ah." He asked how I'd been, but not the way most people ask. He looked at me like he wanted the real answer. I gave it to him, in pieces. I told him about the mail, about the document I found open but unsigned, about the way my name seemed to be fading from the decisions around me. I told him I felt like I was being gradually filed away, tucked into some drawer, labeled someday, not now. And he didn't interrupt, didn't correct or fix. He just listened. I hadn't been truly listened to in years. When I slid the folder across the table, the one with the deed copies and legal notes from Harold, his eyes scanned the contents carefully. He asked a few quiet questions. Not about the drama, not about my son, not about her. Just about logistics, process, timing. I told him what I wanted to transfer the house title back into my name fully. And then, should anything happen, to pass it to someone I trusted. He looked at me, really looked, and said I'd be honored it. Wasn't about punishing them. I need to make that clear. I didn't sit across from him to get back at anyone. I sat there because I needed to believe I still had the right to protect what mattered to me. My home, my peace, my name. When I left the cafe, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not joy exactly, but direction. I walked slower on the way back to my car. I let the air move around me. I saw a dog with a lopsided ear and smiled at it without needing to be seen. That night, I cooked for myself, not for them. I made roasted carrots with honey and cumin. And I ate at the small table near the window, alone. It was the most peaceful meal I'd had in months. The sound of their television in the other room didn't reach me. Neither did their conversation. I was learning how to live beside them without shrinking under them. A few days later, Harold called. Everything was filed. The new deed had been processed. The protection clause was included. I was the sole owner again. My name, unshared, unqualified, unapologetic. I sat with that information like it was a secret treasure. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I wasn't ready to share it just yet. I wanted to wait, to watch them quietly, to see what they did when they still believed they had control. The first hint came that Sunday. She knocked on my bedroom door, the one she usually left closed unless she wanted something, and asked if I had time to go over some plans. Her voice was warm, too warm. It had that cloying tone honey gets when it's past its shelf life. I followed her to the dining room, where my son was already seated with his laptop open. There were brochures on the table. Assisted living communities. Retirement apartments. Florida, mostly. One local, I looked at the brochures like they were maps to some foreign country I hadn't agreed to visit. She talked a lot. About independence. About simplifying life. About how they'd been doing research just to help. Of course. Just to be proactive. I asked them one question. Who asked you to? The silence afterwards stretched longer than it needed to. She said, gently, that sometimes hard decisions have to be made out of love. That they didn't want to wait for something to happen. That this was about safety. Peace of mind, mine, she meant. But really, it was theirs. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I thanked them for thinking of me. I picked up the Florida brochure and ran my fingers along the glossy edge. Then I asked if they were aware that I'd transferred the title back. That I was now the only legal owner of the house. The air changed immediately. She blinked. My son looked confused, like I'd spoken another language. I said it again clearly. The house is mine, solely legally. I've seen to it she recovered faster than he did. Said we should talk through this. Said it sounded like something I'd been misinformed about. I smiled and told her I had the papers, filed and certified. And then I excused myself, walked to my room, and closed the door. Behind that door, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the carpet. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady, like someone who'd spent years being told she was confused, only to find clarity was hers all along, just waiting to be claimed. The morning after I told them about the title, there was a quietness in the house that didn't feel like peace. It felt like waiting. It's like something was being restructured. Behind closed doors, she barely looked at me when we crossed paths in the hallway. My son kept his head down, fiddling with his keys, pretending to check his phone. I watched them. That's all I did. Just watched. I started paying attention to patterns I had once ignored. The way she always insisted on opening the mail now, as if I couldn't be trusted with something as simple as an envelope. The way bills came less frequently, or came in her name instead of mine. The way she'd hover near the phone when it rang, offering to answer it for me, even if it was sitting right beside me at first. I thought it was just garden variety, controlling. Then I began to wonder if it was something more. One afternoon, when they were both out, some charity event or networking thing, I went to the office room. It's the one that used to be mine, before it was painted in beige and reorganized into something sleek and soulless. She kept the file drawers locked. But old habits die hard, and I remembered the spare key taped under the desk drawer. I'd put it there years ago for emergencies, never imagining the emergency would come from within the walls of my own home. I unlocked the drawer and pulled the files slowly, one by one. Medical insurance, banking. I went through them like a woman reading her own biography for the first time. There were things I didn't recognize, appointments I'd supposedly canceled, providers I'd never heard of. And then I saw the binder. It was navy blue with silver edges and a small label that simply read Next Steps. Inside were documents I hadn't signed, notes on elder care attorneys, email printouts between her and a consultant who specialized in managing aging parents. There were lists, my medications, my habits, phrases like mild cognitive delay and increasing need for supervision. She was collecting a case. I remember staring at one particular sentence. Written in her voice, but in someone else's report, she's begun misplacing things more often. She's lost weight and seems confused. In the mornings, that was the week I had the flu. I'd barely eaten for days, and the medicine made me groggy. She made soup one night and brought it in like a nurse. I had thanked her. She had been observing me, documenting me, deciding for me. I should have felt rage. But what I felt was grief. Grief. For the years I gave to this family, for the grace I extended when she joined our lives. When she walked into our home like she was stepping onto a stage already arranged for her, I gave her room. I made space. I deferred and made quiet compromises in my own house so she could feel like she belonged. And she used that space to set traps. I sat there in the office with the blue binder on my lap and my hands trembling, not from age, not from confusion, but from the weight of clarity. It's heavy, the truth, when it lands all at once. That night I didn't sleep. Caped the binder under my bed, tucked between the frame and the box of old photographs I hadn't looked at in years. And around 3 in the morning, I turned on the lamp and made a list of my own. Every account I still had access to. Every friend I hadn't called in too long. Every document I needed to review. Every single thing that still had my name on it. Or DIDN, single quotes. One to Harold to tell him what I'd found and ask what it meant. One to my financial advisor, Linda, a woman I hadn't spoken to in nearly a year. And one to my friend Nadine, who had once worked in elder law before her husband passed. Linda picked up immediately, said she'd been trying to reach me for months, that my account access had changed, that certain notifications were being rerouted. She thought I'd asked for it. When I told her I hadn't, her voice dropped, quiet and sharp. She told me she'd email me everything. Privately, Nadine took longer to call back. But when she did, she didn't hesitate. She told me what to look for, key phrases, paperwork shifts, patterns of concern that could be used to petition for guardianship or financial authority. I wrote everything down, 3 pages worth. I realized then, they weren't just planning to move me out of the house. They were trying to prepare a version of me that couldn't say no. It's a slow betrayal, the kind wrapped in legalities and medical language. You start as a mother, a woman, a person. Then you become a liability, a checkbox, K line item in someone else's agenda. I didn't say anything to them yet. I waited. I kept smiling. I asked her if she could pick up milk on her way back from her yoga class. I asked him if he could bring the broom down from the attic. I played my part perfectly, but behind my back I was assembling an army. Harold began drafting the reversals. Linda reviewed the accounts. Nadine helped me write an affidavit of capacity, a legal document that stated in no uncertain terms that I was of sound mind and that any representation otherwise had been made without my consent. And I made one more phone call to the county records office to double-check that the property deed had finalized properly. It had, and I smiled when I hung up. Because now I knew they didn't know that I knew. Not yet. They were building a quiet cage around me, but I had already found the key. There's a moment when grief turns into something else. Not anger, not even defiance, just clarity. A cooling of the blood. A stillness that settles into the bones like early morning frost. That was me now. I no longer cried in secret, no longer hoped to be heard. I no longer waited for them to explain themselves. I didn't need their confession. I had the proof. I had the papers, the statements, the whispers I'd overheard in stairwells when they thought I'd gone to bed and I had myself. That was the difference. I'd spent so long adjusting to their rhythm, walking quieter, stepping aside, fading politely. I'd learned to be smaller in my own home, to ask for space that was once mine by right. And every time I did, I lost a little more of myself, folded down like a note no one would ever read. But now I walked differently. I didn't make a show of it. It wasn't dramatic, but I took up space again. I used my favorite mug in the mornings, even though she'd hidden it behind the holiday china. I played music in the kitchen when I cooked real music. Nina Simone, Ella Fitzgerald, not the silent scrolling of her phone while she hovered. She noticed she didn't say anything, but she noticed her smile tightened. Her eyes lingered. Longer. My son barely looked up from his plate. There was one afternoon, early in the week, when she stood in the doorway to my room, holding a basket of laundry that I hadn't asked her to do. She asked if I was feeling okay. I told her I was feeling quite well, actually. She nodded too slowly. Her mouth made a small twitch. Then she said I'd been seeming a little different lately. She meant sharper, louder, present, I told her, kindly, that maybe I'd simply been more myself. She said nothing, just turned and left, the scent of her expensive lotion trailing behind like a veil. They were watching me now, but I didn't flinch. I moved forward with everything. The paperwork, the calls, the private meetings, the quiet repairs to my name. I went back to Harold's office and signed a supplemental directive stating that no changes to my financial or medical life could be made without my written approval. Witnessed and notarized. I added Nadine as an emergency contact. I updated the locks, just the front and back, quietly. I told no one, because something happens when you speak too soon. They move faster. They twist the story. They rewrite you before you've finished writing yourself. So I kept it all inside. The knowing, the planning, the slowly rising strength that sat inside me like coals at the bottom of a fire. Quiet, but burning. One morning, I sat out on the porch swing. The very one they said should be removed last year because it was too old and wobbly. But I'd repaired it myself, oiled the hinges, replaced the frayed ropes. I sat there with my tea wrapped in the shawl my husband gave me for our 30th anniversary. The one she once called dated and offered to donate. It was early, just after 6. The sky was the color of dishwater turning to pearl. Birds chattered along the fence line, gossiping before the day began. And I let myself remember. I remembered holding my son in this same swing, back when his legs dangled and his worries were small. I remembered stories I used to tell him, about strength and love, and not letting the world make you less than who you are. And I thought, what would that boy think of the man he's become? Would he recognize himself? Would he recognize me? I don't know. And I've stopped needing the answer, because the truth is, I gave him everything. And he let someone teach him how to turn that into currency. My care became leverage. My trust became loopholes. My quiet love became silence they used against me. But that ends now. The inner shift didn't come with a breakdown. It came with breath, with posture, with decisions made in rooms no one else was allowed to enter. It came when I stood in the mirror and didn't look away. When I stopped adjusting the waist of my pants because I felt like I took up too much space in the hallway. When I poured myself a glass of wine on a Wednesday and read by the fire without asking if the light bothered anyone, it came the night. I removed their framed wedding photo from the hallway and replaced it with one of my own, me and my sister on the beach. In 1972, wind in our hair, arms open to the sea, no one said anything. But I saw her glance at it. Twice, I suppose that's the most dangerous thing you can do to people who want you pliable. Become unbothered, still certain. She asked me once recently if I'd considered what would happen if I got sick. Her voice was low, rehearsed. She said she'd read about how women my age were often unprepared for the shift. I told her without blinking I was prepared for every kind of shift, that I'd already made all the arrangements. Her eyes tightened. But she didn't press. And I think that's when she finally realized I wasn't confused. I wasn't forgetful. I wasn't frail or fading or waiting to be managed. I was choosing carefully, deliberately, and without noise to stand in the full shape of who I've always been. She couldn't stop me, and I think that scared her more than any confrontation ever could. It happened in the kitchen. Of course it did. That house had many rooms, but the kitchen was the one they always claimed. Her scent was in the drawers, citrus and steel. Her rules hung in the air. No clutter on the counters. No warm leftovers in the pot, always stored, always labeled. My son's coffee mug had a hook. Mine got pushed to the back, near the chipped ones meant for guests. She was at the stove stirring something. Soup, I think. Carrot and ginger. My son sat at the table, scrolling on his phone, half listening to the news in the background. It was late afternoon, and the light through the window made everything look gentler than it really was. It always did that, softened the hard edges, wrapped every room in forgiveness. I stood there for a moment before speaking, long enough for her to glance over her shoulder. She said something casual, how I looked nice in that sweater, how it was a good color for me. It wasn't kindness. It was placement. It's a way to direct the conversation, frame it. I didn't thank her. I told her gently that I'd been meaning to talk. That there were some things I'd discovered and some things I wanted to clear up. Her back stiffened. She turned the burner off but didn't turn to face me. My son looked up slowly. His face didn't hold surprise, just a waiting, a bracing, like he'd known something was coming. I laid the folder on the table. It's the blue binder. The one she thought I hadn't found. She still didn't turn around, so spoke to him. I said I'd come across some documents that concerned me about my health, about my mental state, about decisions being discussed without my consent. He said he didn't know about most of it. He sounded like a child, soft, caught. She finally turned. Her expression was calm, practiced. She said it had only been planning, that she'd been trying to help, that I'd seemed different lately. She said I'd misplaced things, seemed tired, withdrawn, that she was just trying to be proactive. I told her I hadn't misplaced anything, that I had seen the emails, the annotations, the flagged symptoms, that I'd seen the notes that made me out to be a fading woman, weak, slow, docile. I told her I was none of those things. She started to interrupt, said I was overreacting, that I must have misunderstood, that there was more context. I raised my hand once, not high, just enough. And I asked her not to speak for me anymore. Then I turned to my son. I asked him, calmly, if he'd ever truly believed I was unwell, that I was losing myself. He looked away. That was answer enough. I told them both that I had reinstated full ownership of the home, that all documentation had been corrected and witnessed, that any legal guardianship or decision-making filed without my consent had been revoked, that my accounts were back under my name, only mine, that my health directives had been rewritten, notarized, and stored securely, that my memory was intact, that my voice would no longer be sidelined. I told them I had signed nothing, not ever, that gave them permission to write me out of my own life, and that moving forward, I would no longer be asking to be respected. I would simply be expecting it. There was silence then. Not the kind that follows drama, but the kind that settles like dust after truth has passed through a room. She stared at me like she didn't recognize me. My son did something worse. He looked like he did recognize me and didn't know what to do with it. She said it was a mistake, a misunderstanding, that they'd never meant to hurt me. I nodded. Maybe they hadn't meant to, but they had. And I told her that intention did not erase consequence. She tried one more tactic, said we were family, said we should handle things with love, not lawyers. I told her love doesn't hide paperwork. Love doesn't rewrite a person's capacity. It's behind her back. Love doesn't prepare for your absence while you're still pouring the tea. I said it all with a voice so steady it surprised even me. She stepped back. My son was quiet. The folder sat between us like a fire that had already burned through everything soft. I picked it up and walked out of the room. No drama, no storming. It's just movement. Later that night, I heard them talking, low, tight. The language of people calculating. A new strategy. I didn't lean in to hear the words. Didn't care. Because the confrontation wasn't about victory. It wasn't about changing them. It was about reclaiming myself. It was about standing in my truth, speaking in full sentences, and letting the silence that followed carry its own weight. That night, I slept with the window open. The wind was cool. The stars were faint, but they were there, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had nothing left to prove. They had finally seen the woman they'd tried to erase, and I hadn't even raised my voice. The next morning, I woke early, not because I had somewhere to be or something urgent to do, but because my mind was clear. That hadn't happened in a while, waking up without that low, persistent hum of anxiety. I used to start each day wondering what part of me they'd chip away at next. But not anymore. Now I was building again. I made my tea slowly, one hand on the warm edge of the kettle, the other steady on the ceramic mug I'd kept hidden in the pantry, the one she once called too chipped to look nice. It was a gift from my sister. I'd repaired it myself with a little gold glue along the crack. I didn't care how it looked. It held warmth. That was enough. They were quiet that morning. No sharp footsteps, no doors swinging open. The whole house felt like it was waiting for something. But I wasn't. I'd already made my decisions. After breakfast, I called Nadine again. She was the only friend I'd kept in regular touch with after everything else started fading after the dinner stopped. The calls went unanswered. The invitations began arriving last minute. She understood that. Kind of quiet abandonment. Own son had moved across the country and only called her on holidays, if at all. We didn't need to explain things to each other anymore. We just knew. When she picked up, I didn't ask how she was. I just said, "It's time." She came by that afternoon, holding a leather tote bag and wearing that deep maroon scarf she always wore when something serious was happening. She'd worn it to her husband's memorial and again when she signed the papers to downsize her home. Last year, she sat with me in the garden under the pergola I built with my husband years ago. The roses had wilted in the corners, but the jasmine was still strong, still bright. We didn't speak for a while, just sat with the breeze between us. Sometimes the presence of someone who sees you without needing to be convinced is enough. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. Inside were blank affidavits, sample letters, and a copy of a living trust template. She explained everything with a calm, even voice. Legal language had always scared me, but with her, it felt manageable. She underlined things in pencil, and every now and then she paused to check if I needed a break. I never did. We worked for 3 hours. I wrote things down in my own words. I signed where I needed to. I made a list of places to call next. The county assessor, the bank manager, the healthcare proxy center. Nadine helped me draft a letter to a local notary who did house calls. We even made copies of everything. 2 sets, one for me. One for a safe place she'd keep for me, just in case, by the time she left. The sun had dipped behind the neighbor's fence and the porch light had flickered on. She hugged me before she walked to her car, but not the soft kind of hug people give when they think you're fragile. It was full and strong, like she was transferring something to me, courage, maybe, or assurance. After she drove away, I stood there in the driveway a long time. The sky was turning blue-black. A few stars began to show. I used to watch the stars with my husband. We'd name them wrongly just for fun. He'd point and call one the kitchen sink or the world's last good egg. I smiled at the memory. And then I did something I hadn't done in months. I called someone just to say, "Hello, Linda." My financial advisor had offered to go over everything with me again, slowly, as many times as I needed. We set up a time for her to come by the kid. Following week, I told her I wanted every account double-checked, every authorization verified. She didn't treat me like a burden. She said, "We'll get it right together." Just like that. And later that night, I called the man I'd met for coffee. My son's ex-husband. I hadn't spoken to him since the day he helped me transfer. The title, I didn't want to drag him into things. I didn't want him to feel used. But that night, I didn't call him for help. I called because I wanted to hear the voice of someone who remembered me before all this. Someone who knew who I was before the word burden hung in the corners of every conversation. He picked up on the second ring. I told him thank you for showing up, for not needing an explanation, for saying yes when he could have turned away. He said I didn't need to thank him. That when he heard my voice that day at the cafe, it felt like something right was finally being restored. I asked him if he'd ever felt invisible when he was married to my son. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, softly, all the time. We talked about nothing for an hour. Old books. A garden he was trying to grow. The way silence can feel heavier when it comes from family. When we hung up, I sat by the window. The house was still. The folder from Nadine sat on the table, its contents labeled and clipped. I thought about the women I knew, friends, cousins, neighbors who'd been worn down by quiet dismissal, smoothed out of their own stories before they even saw it happening. But I wasn't going to be one of them. I was gathering my name back, piece by piece, not to prove anything to them, but because I had decided Finally, that I was worth the paperwork. It happened at the doctor's office, the one I'd been going to for years, long before they started treating me like I couldn't drive myself there. She insisted on coming with me that day. Said she wanted to keep everything straight, which I found ironic. I'd already rescheduled the appointment once without telling her. I'd spoken to Dr. Martin directly. Told him I wanted the conversation recorded in my file. My voice, not hers. I asked him to make room on the schedule. Just a few extra minutes, he agreed. So when she offered to drive me that morning, I said yes. Not because I needed the ride, but because I wanted her to be there, to hear me speak, uninterrupted. To watch me stand inside my own clarity and not flinch. The waiting room smelled of paper and lemon disinfectant. She filled out my form without asking. I watched her, let her finish. Then I asked for another copy and filled it out again, line by line in my own hand. She didn't like that. Her lips tightened, but she said nothing. When they called my name, I stood without waiting for her. She followed. Dr. Martin greeted me kindly. He's a young man, sharp but not arrogant, the kind who still looks people in the eye. I'd seen him for sinus infections, for arthritis flares, for one stubborn case of shingles that made me cry into my pillow at night. He'd always been gentle. But now he looked at me differently with attention. He offered her a seat, and then looked directly at me. I began. I told him I wanted to reaffirm my capacity, verbally and in writing, that I had no diagnosis of cognitive impairment, that I was fully able to make my own medical decisions, and any recent suggestions to the contrary had been made without my consent or involvement. He nodded slowly, asked me a few questions about dates, current events, medications, names of providers. I answered them all with clarity, calmly, no shaking hands, no lost words. She sat there, her purse clutched too tightly on her lap. Then I said very clearly that I wanted it added to my file that I had revoked any medical proxy rights she may have assumed, that I had appointed Nadine as my advocate, and that I wished to be informed in writing of any attempts to challenge or modify that status. The words sat heavy in the room, not loud. Just final. Dr. Martin nodded. He turned to her and said gently, but plainly, that it was my right, that nothing further would be discussed unless I asked for it. She started to speak something about misunderstandings, about how she'd only meant to help. But I raised my hand again the same way I had in the kitchen. Not to silence, just to separate. I said, I know what you meant, but that doesn't change what you did. Dr. Martin cleared his throat and stood. Said he'd print the forms himself. Said I could stop by the front desk for notarization if I wanted. He left the room. I was alone with her. I didn't say much more. I didn't need to. She said she didn't understand where this was all coming from. That I seemed so different lately. I told her I wasn't different. I was just awake now. She said she'd only been trying to make things easier. Said, easier for whom? Her face changed then. The mask slipped, just a little. The frustration showed. The control slipping from her hands, not violently, but quietly, like sand through a fist. She stood up without saying goodbye, walked out before the forms were printed. I heard her heels click down the hall like punctuation. When I got to the front desk, waited calmly, signed what needed to be signed, took a copy home with me. When I got back to the house, my house, she was already in the kitchen, pretending to make a salad she wouldn't eat. My son was at the table. I didn't speak to them. I went to my room, closed the door. The next morning, she came to me with a carefully worded apology. Said she'd misunderstood, said it had been hard adjusting to generational dynamics. That phrase stayed with me. Generational dynamics. As if this had been some polite mishmash of perspectives and not a slow attempt to erase me. I nodded, said thank you. Then I handed her a letter. It was from Harold, stamped and signed. A formal notification of my updated estate documents, which no longer included either of them. She opened it with shaking hands. I watched her read it. Watched her eyes pause at the phrases irrevocable, notified parties, excluded from future claims. She said nothing, but I saw her swallow. I didn't wait for her response. I walked outside, down the path to the mailbox, and lifted. The red flag inside was a small envelope I'd addressed the week before. It was going to my sister's daughter, the one who sent handwritten thank you cards and always signed her messages with real ink. I'd written to tell her I was coming to visit, that I might be gone for a while. I stood on the porch afterward, the wind catching the edge of my sleeve, and I felt light. Not because I had punished anyone, but because, I had chosen myself. Finally. And without apology, it rained. The morning I packed my suitcase, not a dramatic downpour, just a soft, steady drizzle. The kind that taps against the windows like an old friend saying, "It's time." I stood by the kitchen sink, watching droplets run down the glass, and I felt something in me shift, not break. Not crack, just open. I had made my decision days earlier, but I hadn't told them. I didn't owe them that anymore. They had made decisions about me in whispers, behind walls, and inside documents I was never meant to see. Now I had done the same, only mine were honest, above board, and sealed with my full name in ink. It wasn't about revenge. I keep saying that because it's true. I wasn't trying to hurt them. I wasn't looking for a scene. I didn't want apologies or begging. I just wanted to feel whole again. And sometimes the only way to become whole is to walk away from the place where you were broken. I packed slowly, one sweater at a time. A photo of my husband, the one where he's laughing mid-sentence, eyes crinkled, my gardening gloves. 2 books, a notebook, and the small green tin that held the earrings my mother gave me when I turned 25. I left the rest. Let them keep the things they clung to, the matching towels, the curated living room, the smart fridge with its buzzing reminders. Let them sit in a house where silence would stretch wider than the rooms. Now that I wasn't filling them quietly with my presence before I zipped the suitcase. I walked through the house one last time. I didn't do it to say goodbye. I did it to remind myself of what I survived. The corner near the hallway where my favorite chair once sat, now replaced with a modern bench no one ever used. The guest room that was mine before it became multifunctional. The fireplace mantel once full of framed memories, now cleared except for a single potted orchid she never watered. Each space had been reshaped without me. But now I was shaping something new. I left a letter on the table, nothing cruel. Just a note that said I was safe, I was well, and I was reclaiming the rest of my life. And then I wheeled my suitcase to the porch, locked the door behind me, and didn't look back. My ride arrived at 10 a.m. sharp, driven by the man who helped me quietly secure the deed. My son's ex-husband. He stepped out of the car and took my bag without asking. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer commentary. Just opened the passenger door and said, "Ready when you are." I was. We didn't drive far. It's just a few towns over, to a small, sunlit apartment complex nestled behind a row of sycamores. Nothing fancy, but the kind of place with clean walkways, kind neighbors, and windows that actually opened wide. I'd already signed the lease in my name. A loan paid in advance. Keys in hand. He carried my bag inside, set it down gently, and stood awkwardly near the door. I offered him tea. He said yes. We sat on the small balcony while it steeped. Watching the sky clear itself of rain, he asked me if I felt free. I told him freedom didn't always come with fanfare. Sometimes it looked like brewing your own tea without commentary, folding your own towels, opening your own mail. Sometimes freedom just feels like a quiet room where no one is planning your absence. He nodded. Then he said something I hadn't expected. He said I'd given him courage, that watching me leave the house they'd tried to trap me in made him feel like maybe he wasn't a fool for leaving when he did. I looked at him and said, "You weren't a fool. You were just early." We laughed, and it wasn't heavy. It was light, like the space between two people who'd both been erased and had now chosen to draw new outlines after he left. I opened the windows and let the wind in. I placed the photo of my husband on the sill. hung my shawl over the arm of the chair, lit a candle that smelled like sandalwood and earth. I was not lonely. Loneliness is what I felt back in that house, surrounded by voices that spoke over me. Here, in the stillness, I felt present. The next morning, I walked to the corner bakery and bought myself a scone. The woman behind the counter called me ma'am, with a smile that felt genuine. I sat by the window and ate slowly. No one asked where I was going next. No one watched me like I was fragile glass. I paid in cash. My name was on the receipt. Later that week, I met with Linda at the cafe nearby. She helped me go through everything again, account by account. We set up alerts and redundancies. We added Nadine as my secondary and discussed charitable trusts. I'd never thought I'd be in a position to give. She told me, smart for getting ahead of it all. I told her I wasn't being smart. I was just finally being seen. That evening, I sat in my new living room, soft music humming, tea in hand. And I thought, this is what it feels like to come home to yourself. No one hovering, no one redefining you behind your back. No one calling you a burden while eating at your table, just you. Still here, still, still holding the pen the deed transfer went through on a Tuesday. I sat at my new kitchen table, soft winter light pooling across the wood grain, when the call came from Harold's office. His assistant Theo was the one who said it, gently, like handing over something sacred. It's finalized, he said. You're done. I didn't speak for a second. Closed my eyes and let the words sink in. I hadn't realized how heavy it had still been, even after I moved, that dull weight of unfinished business, still being tethered legally, emotionally. To a house that no longer held me now, it didn't, because I had sold it, not to a stranger, not to someone who would gut the place and turn it into a showroom, but to someone who knew its history and knew mine. It was his idea. Really. My son's ex-husband. He said it over coffee one morning, hands wrapped around his mug like he was bracing for a no. He said he'd thought about buying a house again, and if I ever wanted to truly let go of the old place, he'd be honored to care for it. I didn't say yes right away. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I had to make sure I was ready. Letting go of that house meant something final. It meant letting the past rest, letting my husband's workbench stay behind, letting the tree we planted the year our son was born grow without me. But it also meant letting go of the rooms where I was ignored, of the staircase where I once stood and overheard them making plans for my life without me, of the kitchen where she'd looked me in the eye and said I was becoming too much. And so I said yes. Harold helped draw up the documents. Fair price, clean terms, no confusion, no loopholes. I was listed as sole seller, he as sole buyer. When I signed the papers, my hand didn't shake, and when the check cleared, I didn't cry. I simply felt finished. I didn't tell my son or her. They would find out in due time. The change would arrive in an envelope they didn't expect, delivered on a day they thought was still theirs. There was no drama, no threats, just a clean transfer of ownership, of story, of power. After the sale went through, I visited the house one last time. He'd invited me, said he wanted me to come by before he moved things in. I walked the rooms barefoot. Floors felt the same. The walls held a different kind of quiet now, one without judgment. The dining room table was gone, so was her cold silver bowl that had always sat at the center. The light through the windows looked softer, somehow, as if it too had been waiting for this moment. I walked out to the garden. The jasmine was blooming again, unbothered by absence. A new wind chime hung on the pergola, its sound low and wooden, like breathing. He stood nearby but didn't speak. He let me have the space. Before I left, I touched the banister one last time. It's the one my husband sanded smooth after our son tripped and scraped his knee. I ran my fingers along it like a prayer, then let it go. He walked me to the car, said, "Thank you." And I said, "Take care of it." And he said, "I will." That was it. No grand goodbyes. No ceremony, just a clean break. A closed door that didn't slam back in my apartment. I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the open window. I listened to the evening sounds, distant traffic, a dog barking, a child laughing somewhere below. And I thought about what it means to leave something fully, to not just walk out, but to remove your name, your weight, your history. To choose, on paper and in practice, to reclaim what's yours and then give it only where it will be honored. I thought about how many women I've known who never got that chance, who were pushed into homes they didn't choose, whose bank accounts were shifted slowly out of their reach, whose memories were questioned until they gave up trying to speak. I thought about how easy it would have been for me to go quietly and how quietly I still went, but on my own terms. That night, I wrote in my notebook. Just a few lines. I wrote, "You can be erased gently, but you can also reclaim yourself quietly." The key is not volume, it's clarity. A house is not a home if it doesn't make room for your voice. And then I closed the notebook and went to bed. I slept with the window open again. Not because I needed air, but because I'd made space. Inside me, around me, in the story they tried to steal. I didn't expect anything from them after the sale. No letter. No knock at my door. No carefully phrased apology dressed up as concern. And I got what I expected, which was its own kind of relief. I had already begun to feel the outlines of my new days settle into shape. They were quieter than before, not because I was being silenced, but because there was no one left trying to speak over me. The silence I lived in now was mine, and it was beautiful. The first Monday in my new apartment, I bought a fern. It sat in a ceramic pot by the balcony door, where the light was strongest mid-morning. I named it Margot. I talked to it while I drank my tea. It's not because I was lonely, but because I could. Because I liked the way the leaves responded to warmth and attention, how they seemed to lean just a little toward kindness every day. I did something small to remind myself that I was no longer waiting for permission. I ordered fabric swatches for curtains. I cooked what I wanted without asking if the smell would bother anyone. I wore earrings, again, small silver ones, nothing loud, and caught my reflection one afternoon in the window, surprised by how certain I looked. Sometimes people talk about freedom like it has to be wild or loud or full of color. But mine wasn't. Mine was soft, measured, like a tide that had finally stopped. Retreating, Nadine visited on Fridays. She brought pastries, stories, legal tips, sometimes all three at once. We laughed more than we used to. It was the kind of laughter that comes from having survived something in silence and finally sitting across from someone who knows how deep that silence really went. One day, she brought over a copy of a letter someone had written to the editor of a magazine. A woman our age writing about how her adult children had restructured her living situation without asking. She read it aloud while we drank lemon tea, and when she got to the line that said, "I wasn't old, I was just inconvenient," she had to stop and press her hand over her chest. We sat there a long time after that, not needing to say a word. I sent a letter, too. Not to them, but to my niece, the one who still sent real mail and signed her notes in cursive. I told her that I'd like to come visit in the spring. She had space. I told her about my fern, about Nadine, about the fabric swatches I couldn't quite decide on. She wrote back the next week, said she'd love to have me, said she'd clear out the guest room, and that she remembered the way I used to braid her hair when she was little, and that she still thought about it every time she passed by the hairbrush aisle. That letter sat on my nightstand for 3 days before I tucked it into the drawer beside my bed. Not because I didn't want to look at it, but because I wanted to keep it close. I was making a life again, not from scratch, but from what had always been mine, just buried under layers of being needed, then discarded, then managed. One afternoon, I ran into a woman at the market. Joan, an old friend of a friend. She hadn't seen me in over a year. She tilted her head and said I looked different, lighter. I told her I'd moved. She said, "Oh." I told her yes, out of the house I paid for but wasn't allowed to own anymore. And into one where every square inch is mine, down to the chipped mug on the counter. She didn't know what to say. But she put her hand over mine for a moment and said, "Good for you, love." I walked home in the sun that day, to oranges in my bag and a smile I didn't even realize, swearing. And when I passed by the bookstore near the corner, the one with the window full of forgotten hardcovers, I saw a sign in the window. Writing Circle Thursdays at 6 p.m., all ages, all stories. I stood there a while reading that sign again and again. My story wasn't done, I realized. Wasn't even close. And maybe it was time to start writing it down, not just speaking it into the dark. The writing circle met in the back room of the bookstore. It smelled like paper and ink and something. Older, maybe dust, maybe history. The walls were lined with books that had likely not been opened in years. And the light above the table flickered once before settling into a soft amber glow. There were 6 of us, 3 women, 2 men, and a girl who looked to be just out of college but carried a notebook like it had saved her life. No one asked for explanations. We each brought what we had, pages, fragments, half-finished thoughts written on the backs of envelopes. I didn't bring anything the first night, just myself. That felt like enough. We went around the circle reading small pieces aloud. Funny, some raw. No one interrupted. No one corrected. We just listened. When it came to me, I said I hadn't brought anything to share. But I was here to write. I'd spent too many years speaking only in kitchens and courtrooms and quiet. Rooms where people decided who I was without asking. They nodded. Not with pity, but recognition. I went home that night with my notebook heavier than before. I wrote until midnight. Not about them. Not about the betrayal. But about the woman who came after. The woman I was still getting to know. She was steadier. Quieter, yes, but not small. She liked reading in the mornings with the window open. She kept her shawls folded neatly by the door. She bought raspberries even when they were too expensive because they reminded her of the garden she used to keep and the sweetness she thought. She'd forgotten. I wrote about the porch swing, about the day I let go of the banister and didn't look back, about the moment my name stood alone on the deed and I finally felt like it belonged to me. I didn't write for them. I wrote for the woman who sat inside me for years, waiting for the world to grow quiet enough to hear her own thoughts again. And I kept writing every Thursday. I returned to that circle. By the 3rd week, I brought pages. I read a section about the chipped mug and the fern named Margot. The young woman smiled and wrote something down in her notebook. I didn't ask what. It didn't matter. What mattered was that someone was listening. Sometimes still thought about them. About the dinner table where it all began. About her voice. Smooth, pleasant, calling me a burden without even blinking. About the look on my son's face when I told him I'd taken everything back. But those memories didn't sting anymore. They felt like pages in a book I'd already read. Knew the ending now? I knew where it led, and I didn't need to reread it to feel whole. Spring came early that year. The apartment complex had a small courtyard that bloomed with unexpected color, crocuses, tulips, even a patch of daffodils that seemed to arrive. Overnight, I sat outside with my tea, the sun warm on my arms, and watched the breeze move through the trees. Children played nearby. An older man fed birds from a cracked plastic bowl. I smiled at him. He smiled back. There was no schedule to keep. No one waiting for me to make myself useful. No one watching, judging, managing. Just a day unfolding. I received a letter in April, from my son. It was short. It's 3 sentences. He said he hoped I was well, that he didn't understand why things had unfolded the way they did. But he hoped I had found peace. He didn't apologize. Not really, but I didn't. Need him to anymore? I wrote back. Also short. Also 3 sentences. I said I was doing well, that I had found peace, and that I hoped someday he might too. I didn't invite him to visit. I didn't ask how she was. I didn't reopen the wound. I simply closed the letter with my name and mailed it the next day. That was enough. One afternoon in May, I walked past the house again. I hadn't meant to. I'd been visiting a friend nearby, and my feet had carried me without thinking. The gate was still blue. The jasmine was taller now. There were new curtains in the window. The porch swing had been painted white, and sitting on it was him. The man who now called it home. He saw me. Stood slowly, smiled. I walked up the path, not all the way to the porch, just to the first step. We didn't speak for a moment. Then he said, "It still remembers you." I smiled. I remember it too. He asked if I wanted to come in. I said no, thank you. Not because I wasn't welcome, but because I didn't need to walk through the house again to know it was no longer mine. I waved once, turned, and walked away. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a return, not to a place, but to myself. The day I realized I was truly free. There was no thunderclap, no dramatic moment. I was folding laundry. A simple Tuesday. The smell of clean cotton, the hum of the dryer, the breeze brushing through the screen door. I was matching socks to gray ones, a navy, one bright pink. I didn't even remember buying, and it hit me, gently and fully. No one was waiting for me to finish. No one was calculating what I owed them in return for space or time. Or kindness. Everything in this room belonged to me, not because I'd fought for it, but because I'd finally stopped handing it away. For so long, I thought I had to earn the right to stay in the lives I built. I thought if I made myself small enough, helpful enough, agreeable enough, they would keep me. But they only kept what they could control. And when they could no longer manage me, they prepared to replace me. That's the part no one warns you about, the quiet way you become optional in your own story. How they start writing around you before you realize you've been written out. But I caught it in time, and not with rage, not with revenge, just with truth and pen and signature. With rooms I no longer had to tiptoe through. With paper trails I now own, with one final signature. And a firm closing of the door. I'm not angry anymore. That surprised me. 2, I thought I'd carry the bitterness longer, that it would live in my chest like a stone I'd have to learn. Around, but at DN single quotes, because when you begin again, really begin, there's no room for weight that doesn't belong to you. Now, one spend mornings in the courtyard garden, clipping herbs I actually use. The rosemary is hardy. The basil never lasts long. I have a neighbor who brings me lemons. Sometimes we sit under the shared umbrella and talk about nothing important. And it feels like a luxury I didn't know I missed. On weekends, I write. Not about them, not anymore. I write about small things. A woman learning to swim again. Pair of gloves left on a train. A birthday cake made by someone who isn't sure she'll be invited to her own celebration. And some nights, I leave the notebook open beside me while I fall asleep. Not to finish anything, because the sound of my own voice written clearly on the page makes me feel more alive than any apology ever could. I haven't heard from them since that last letter, and that's okay. I don't need them to circle back. Some stories don't close with reconciliation. Some close with release. And peace is not a place you arrive at all at once. It comes in layers. In the way you stop checking the door, in the way you start humming while you stir the soup, in the way you no longer hesitate before writing your full name at the top of the page. There's a woman I pass on my morning walks. It's older than me, maybe. She wears a red coat and always waves. We've never spoken. But each time she passes, I think she knows what it's like to be used for your stability. Then treated like a weight, knows how it feels when the very people you built your life around begin designing a future without you in it. Knows the quiet satisfaction of saying, no more. I don't think I'm alone. I think there are women all over in small apartments, in spare rooms, in silence they didn't choose, who are slowly, steadily finding their way back. And maybe they won't make the grand gesture. Maybe they won't sell the house or call the lawyer or confront anyone face to face. But maybe they'll do something even braver. Maybe they'll stop apologizing. Maybe they'll take their name back. Maybe they'll sit alone in the quiet and realize they're still here, still sharp, still whole, still sovereign. That's what this was really about. In the end, not the deed, not the betrayal, not even the silence that followed. It was about choosing to live in a life that honored me, even if it came later than I thought it would, even If it came without applause, because the truth is, the greatest thing I ever gave them was the version of me that expected nothing. And the greatest thing I ever gave myself was permission to leave her behind. Now I cook what I want. I walk when I want. I water my fern and call it Margot and write in the margins of my favorite books again. And when I look in the mirror, I see someone I trust, not someone they tried to manage, not someone they misjudged, someone I know, someone who stayed, someone who said yes to herself to the next chapter, the room with the open window, and that will always be enough. Now I'm curious about you. Have you ever experienced something like this? Let me know in the comments. And if you stayed with me until now, thank you. I'll leave you with two other stories I think you'll love.